The morning Ellen Wilcox walked into the center of Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a rolled deed in her fist and fury in her dark eyes. Every man on that dusty main street either looked away or stepped back, and only one stranger on a roan horse at the far end of town did neither. It was the summer of 1878, a year when the cattle drives were still thundering up from Texas along the Kisham Trail, when the smell of cow dust and burned grass hung over the flatlands like a permanent weather, and when men like Hector Doyle owned everything the eye could reach and fully intended to own the rest. Hector Doyle was the land baron of Comanche County, a man of 61 years who wore a broadcloth suit regardless of the heat and kept 4 armed men at his side at all times like a royal retinue. He had come to Kansas 15 years before with enough money to buy the goodwill of the county commissioner, the patience to outlast every drought, and the ruthlessness to acquire land from families too broke or too frightened to fight him. He was not a violent man by preference. He simply paid others to be violent on his behalf, which in the long view of things was worse. Ellen Wilcox was 26 years old and had been on her father's homestead since she was 7. She remembered the way her father, Thomas Wilcox, had broken that first acre of buffalo sod with a single mule and a hand plow, how her mother had cried, and then laughed at the same time because the soil underneath was so black and rich, it looked like the inside of something holy. Her father had died of fever 2 winters past, her mother a year before that, and Ellen had kept the 160 acres going by herself with the help of a hired hand named Clement, who was 60 years old and half blind, but could still fix a fence line in the dark. The farm was modest, the house small, the water from a well that ran sweet and cold even in August, and Ellen had no intention of surrendering a single foot of it. Doyle's representative had come 3 times, first with an offer that was low, then with an offer that was insulting, then with a piece of paper that claimed there was a lien on the property dating back 7 years, a lien that Ellen had never heard of and that bore a notary stamp that looked freshly inked to anyone who cared to look closely. The third visit had included 2 of Doyle's armed men standing on either side of the door while the representative, a wiry lawyer named Alton Press, explained very calmly that if Ellen did not sign the transfer of title before the end of the week, the sheriff would come and remove her by order of the court. Ellen had asked Clement what he thought, and Clement had said he thought they were lying, and she should go see the county recorder and look at the original filings herself. She did. She rode the 12 miles into Caldwell alone, found the county recorder's office, and spent 2 hours going through the ledger books until she found the truth, which was that there was no lien. The entry that Alton Press had referenced did not exist in the official record. Someone had filed a fraudulent document with the county court and never registered it with the recorder's office, which meant the whole scheme had a visible seam running right down the middle of it. That was the morning she walked into the center of town with the deed in her fist. She had gotten word, through a woman named Clara Briggs who ran the dry goods store and knew everything about everyone in Comanche County, that Hector Doyle himself would be in Caldwell that Thursday for the weekly cattle auction. She also knew that he would stop at the bank, because he always did, and that he would have his men with him, and that Thursday morning the main street would be full of drovers and ranchers and townspeople going about the business of a market day. Ellen had decided that a public confrontation was her best protection. A man like Doyle could do a great many things quietly, but he could not so easily steal a farm from a woman in front of 100 witnesses without it getting complicated. What she had not fully accounted for was how alone she would feel standing there. She had positioned herself on the boardwalk in front of the bank, 15 minutes before Doyle's black-lacquered buggy came rolling down the center of the street. The street was alive with people. 2 cowhands were arguing over a horse's tooth at the far rail. A woman with 3 children was trying to navigate around a water barrel that had fallen from a wagon. The blacksmith's hammer was ringing. The auction yards at the south end of town smelled of cattle and straw. And Ezekiel Haskins, who had ridden into Caldwell that same morning looking for nothing more than a farrier and a meal, pulled his roan up at the hitching post outside the telegraph office, and began watching the scene in front of the bank without fully understanding, yet, why he was watching it. He was 31 years old, tall in the saddle in the way that comes from years of long riding rather than any deliberate effort at bearing, and he had the kind of face that weather and hard work had arranged into something honest and direct. He had spent the last 4 years working cattle drives up from Texas, had saved enough to be thinking seriously about land of his own somewhere in Kansas or the territories, and had arrived in Caldwell at what would turn out to be a crossroads in his life, disguised as an ordinary Thursday. He noticed the woman first, because she was standing very still while everything around her was in motion. She was dressed practically, a dark skirt and a light shirtwaist with the sleeves pushed to her elbows, her brown hair pinned but already coming loose in the morning heat, and she was holding that rolled paper in both hands like it was a weapon she had not decided to swing yet. There was something in her posture that Ezekiel recognized the way you recognize a sound you have heard before without being able to immediately name it. She was bracing herself, not with fear, exactly, with determination that had not been tested yet and was about to be. Doyle's buggy came to a stop in front of the bank. Alton Press climbed down from the front bench and opened the door, and Hector Doyle stepped out with the slow deliberateness of a man who expected the world to wait for him, which it generally did. He was heavy through the chest, his silver hair swept back neatly under a gray hat, his eyes small and appraising. The 4 men with him spread out in a loose formation that was familiar enough to anyone who knew how intimidation worked. Ellen stepped off the boardwalk and into the street. "Mr. Doyle," she said, and her voice carried well, better than she had probably expected, because the street went quieter than it had been a moment before. "My name is Ellen Wilcox. You have been trying to take my father's farm through a fraudulent lien, and I want you to hear it clearly in front of everyone here that I know it is fraudulent. I have the county deed record to prove it, and I am not leaving my land." Doyle stopped walking. He looked at her the way he might look at an interesting problem he was not entirely sure how to categorize. Press moved slightly forward, but Doyle raised one hand without looking at him and Press stopped. "Miss Wilcox," Doyle said, his voice carrying that particular kind of ease that belongs to men who have never in their adult lives been seriously inconvenienced. "This is not the place for this conversation." "I agree," Ellen said. "The proper place was a fair offer and a legal process, which you chose not to use. So here we are." There was a ripple through the crowd, the particular social electricity of people who have just realized they are watching something real. Men who had been heading for the auction yard slowed down. The woman with 3 children stopped entirely. The blacksmith's hammer went quiet. "You are confused about the documents," Press said, stepping forward now with a thin smile. "The lien is duly recorded and the matter has been filed with the court. You would be well advised to speak with a lawyer rather than making public claims that could expose you to serious legal consequences." "I have been to the county recorder," Ellen said, and now she opened the rolled deed and held it up. "This is the original filing, recorded in 1864 by Thomas Wilcox. There is no lien in that ledger. You filed a document with the court that was never registered with the recorder's office because it does not exist. I would like you to explain that, Mr. Press, in front of everyone currently standing in this street." Doyle's jaw tightened, the first crack in his easy expression. One of his men, a broad-shouldered fellow with a revolver worn low, shifted his weight and looked at his employer. "Take her out of the street," Doyle said quietly to one of his men. Ellen did not step back. "If any man touches me, every person standing here will have seen it, and I will go directly to the Federal Land Office in Wichita and the United States Marshal's office with everything I—" She did not finish the sentence. Ezekiel Haskins had already untied his roan from the hitching post. He had done it the moment he heard Doyle give the quiet instruction to his man, and he had done it with the unhurried decisiveness of someone who has made up his mind without the luxury of time to think about it. He rode the horse into the street at a walk, not charging, not theatrical about it, just moving himself and the horse into the space between Ellen and the men moving toward her, so that those men found themselves looking up at a rider who had positioned himself with the calm assurance of someone who did not consider this an especially complicated situation. "I would hear what the lady has to say," Ezekiel said. His voice was level. He was looking at Doyle, not the hired men, which was the correct thing to look at. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, exhaled in a complicated way. People took small steps back and then stopped again because they did not want to miss what came next. Doyle studied Ezekiel for a moment. "I don't know you," he said. "That's right," Ezekiel said. "Then this is none of your business." "A man giving the order to lay hands on a woman in a public street makes it everybody's business," Ezekiel said. "Including yours, mister." "Doyle, because I count 7 other men with horses on this street right now who are all looking in your direction, and none of them seem real happy about what they just heard." It was true. The drovers at the rail, the men from the auction yard, 2 ranchers who had been talking outside the hardware store. They were not aligned with Doyle. They were just men who knew which side of a line they stood on when the line was drawn clearly enough. Doyle looked at them, and he was smart enough to do the arithmetic. "This matter will be settled through the courts," Doyle said, and his voice had recovered its ease, but it was a managed ease now, controlled rather than natural. He looked at Press, nodded, and then he walked toward the bank door without another word. His men fell in behind him. The last one, the broad-shouldered one with the low-worn revolver, looked at Ezekiel for a long moment before following. The door of the bank closed. Ellen stood in the street with her deed in her hands and her heart going very fast, and she turned and looked at the man on the roan horse who was now looking back down at her with an expression that was not triumph or satisfaction but something quieter, something more like concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "I was not finished speaking." "I know," he said. "I apologize for that." She blinked. She had expected a great many things from the man who had just ridden into that crowd on her behalf, but an apology for interrupting her was not among them. She almost laughed, and she pressed her lips together to prevent it because she was still too tight with adrenaline to laugh easily. "You are a stranger here," she said. "Ezekiel Haskins," he said, and swung down from the roan in that easy way of men who have spent more of their lives in the saddle than out of it. He was taller standing than she had estimated from the boardwalk. "I was looking for a farrier." "Clara Briggs will tell you where to find one," Ellen said. "She knows everything." "Thank you." He paused, and there was a brief interval in which neither of them seemed quite sure what the appropriate social convention was for a situation like this. "Do you need someone to ride back with you, wherever you're going?" "I can manage alone," she said, and it came out more quickly than she intended, and she watched something careful settle over his face, the expression of a man accepting a rebuff gracefully, and she found that she did not exactly want to leave it there. "But I would not refuse company if it was offered in a neutral spirit." He looked at her, and there was a small warmth at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile. "Completely neutral," he said. Her name, he learned, as they rode the 12 miles back to her homestead, was Ellen Wilcox, a fact she delivered with a directness that he found he liked immediately, along with the information that she had lived on the farm for 19 years, that her parents were dead, that she had a hired hand named Clement who she described as indispensable, and that she had no lawyer because she could not afford one, which was why she had decided to make the whole thing public. She explained the fraudulent lien with the precision of someone who had spent days making sure she understood every detail of it, and Ezekiel listened without interrupting, which she noticed and seemed to appreciate. He told her in the plain and unsentimental way that came naturally to him that he had driven cattle up from Texas 4 times, that he was from a small town in Missouri originally, that his parents were farming people who had both lived to see him grown, and that he had been saving with the intention of getting land of his own. He was not sure where yet, He was looking. "Kansas is good land," she said. "I can see that," he said, looking at the plains spreading out ahead of them, the grass moving in the long, slow pulse of the wind. Then he glanced at her, and she did not look back, but she straightened slightly in her saddle. When they came in sight of the homestead, Clement was mending fence near the road, and he looked up with the sharp, attentive squint of a man whose eyesight was unreliable but whose instincts were sharp. He looked at Ellen, then at Ezekiel, then at Ellen again. "Who's this?" he said. "Ezekiel Haskins," Ellen said. "He helped me in town today." "Did he?" Clement said, and his tone carried an enormous amount of freighted meaning in just 2 words, none of which he appeared inclined to elaborate on. Ellen introduced them and then went into the house to see about water and something to eat, because it was past midday and they had ridden 12 miles. And in Kansas in the summer of 1878, hospitality was not an option, it was a reflex. Ezekiel helped Clement with the last 2 fence posts without being asked, which Clement observed silently and appeared to weigh with some internal scale. "She do what she want to do?" Clement asked. "She made her case in public," Ezekiel said. Doyle backed down for now. Clement drove a nail with one clean stroke. "For now," he repeated. "That man doesn't leave things alone." "No," Ezekiel agreed. "I don't imagine he does." They ate lunch at the small table in the kitchen, the 3 of them, bread and salt pork and dried apple, with coffee that Ellen had stretched thin but kept hot, and the conversation moved in the unhurried way of people who are not yet sure what they are to each other but who are not uncomfortable in the uncertainty. Clement talked about a fence line on the south pasture that needed full replacement before winter. Ellen talked about the state of the kitchen garden. Ezekiel talked about the last drive, a herd of 1,200 steers, and a foreman named McCready who had navigated a river crossing in the dark that should by rights have killed half of them. After lunch, Ellen walked him to where his roan was tied at the post near the well. "Thank you," she said. "What you did this morning was unnecessary, but it was kind." "It was necessary," he said simply. She looked at him. The afternoon light was behind him and she had to shade her eyes, which meant she could read his face clearly. It was, she thought, a very honest face. Not handsome in the easy, decorative way of men who knew they were handsome, but the kind of face that would look the same at 31 and 60, and that you could therefore trust to be the same face when things got difficult. "Where are you going next?" she asked. "I hadn't decided," he said. "I need to sort out the farrier business first. My roan threw a shoe outside of Wichita and I've been managing it." "That is too long to manage it," she said. "Come back into town with me tomorrow and I will introduce you to the farrier myself. He charges fairly for strangers if someone vouches." "All right," he said. And then, because he was a direct man and she seemed to be a direct woman, he added, "I'd like to come back after that as well if there's reason to." She was quiet for a moment and he did not rush her. "There might be," she said, and untied his horse and handed him the reins. He came back 2 days later, and then 3 days after that, and on the second visit he helped her reshingle a section of the barn roof that had been leaking since April. And on the third visit, he brought a bag of flour from Clara Briggs's store, because Clara had mentioned that Ellen's supply was low, which was the kind of thing Clara knew, and Ezekiel had decided to act on without making a large announcement about it. Ellen accepted the flour with a combination of gratitude and the specific kind of slight embarrassment that people feel when they have been noticed needing something, and she put it on the shelf and made biscuits for supper, and said nothing about it directly, but made the biscuits with care. They began sitting on the porch in the evenings, after the work was done and the light was going down, Clement having made himself scarce with a tact that was entirely deliberate and entirely invisible. The evenings in Kansas in late June were long and slow, and the sky went through colors that had no names, and they talked in the way that people talk when they are beginning to trust each other with real things rather than polite things. She told him about her father, about the way he had read to her by lamplight every evening regardless of how tired he was, about the way he had believed that this land was the beginning of something for their family and not just a place to get through. She told him about her mother's hands, how they had been rough from work but always warm, and how her mother had died with the quiet acceptance of a woman who had used herself up doing exactly what she meant to do with her life, and was not sorry about it. She told him that she had been engaged once, to a young man named Henry Tate who had left for Colorado 2 years before the engagement was to conclude, and had sent a letter from Denver explaining that he had found different prospects, which was about the coldest way a man had ever been cold to another person that she could think of. Ezekiel listened to all of this. He told her about his own years, about the particular loneliness of the trail drives, not the hardship, which was ordinary enough, but the specific loneliness of a man who was not sure what he was working toward. He told her that he had thought about what it would mean to have a place, not just a job but a place, and that the wanting of it had become sharper as he got older. He told her on the 4th evening that when he had ridden into that crowd in Caldwell on Thursday morning, it had not felt like a decision exactly. It had felt like the only possible thing to do, as if his body had understood something before his mind had time to object, and that he had been thinking about that ever since. She was quiet for a moment. The last light was almost gone and the first stars were appearing, huge and clear the way they only are in the open country. "What have you concluded?" she asked. "That I'd like to know you better," he said, "and that I'd like to be somewhere I am meant to be rather than somewhere I am passing through." She turned and looked at him in the near dark and said, "That is a very careful way to say something." "I'm a careful man," he said. "You rode your horse into a crowd between me and 4 armed men," she said. "That is not especially careful." "No," he said. He looked at her. "That was different." 2 weeks after that first Thursday, Alton Press arrived at the farm with 2 of Doyle's men, and a paper from the county court ordering Ellen to appear before Judge Hartley in Caldwell within 5 days on the matter of the contested lien. Ellen read the paper twice, folded it neatly, and said to Press that she would be there. After they left, she stood in the kitchen for a long time with her hands flat on the table. Clement came in and poured himself coffee and sat down. "We need a lawyer," he said. "We do not have money for a lawyer," she said. "What about that Haskins man?" Clement said, and when she looked at him he added with perfect innocence, "He seems the resourceful type." Ezekiel came the next morning, having heard from Clara Briggs, because Clara knew everything in the way that some people simply do, and it is impossible to account for, about the court summons. He arrived before breakfast and tied his roan at the post and knocked, and when Ellen opened the door he said, "I know someone in Wichita who is a lawyer. Good man, honest. He used to do land filings before he went to the bar. He'll know these documents." She looked at him. "I cannot pay a lawyer." "I know that," he said. "Let me write to him." "That is a great deal to ask of your friend." "He owes me a favor from a river crossing in the dark," Ezekiel said, and the corner of his mouth turned up. She made him breakfast while he wrote the letter, and when he finished she read it over his shoulder, which meant she was standing very close behind him, and neither of them mentioned this. And after she said it was clear and sensible, he folded it and addressed it and rode into Caldwell to the telegraph office to send the fastest possible message. The lawyer's name was Robert Fairweather, and he arrived from Wichita on the Tuesday stage, 2 days before the court date, which was as close to a miracle of timing as the 1878 postal system could produce. He was a compact, cheerful man of 40 with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and he spent 4 hours with Ellen going through every document she had: the original deed, the fraudulent lien document, a copy of the court filing, and the county recorder's ledger pages she had made careful handwritten notes from. At the end of 4 hours he said, "They were careless." The notary stamp on the lien document is from a notary who did not take office until 2 years after the document's stated date. I can prove this with public records. Ellen put her hand over her mouth, then took it away. "Is that enough?" "If Judge Hartley is honest, yes," Fairweather said. "Is he honest?" Ezekiel asked. Fairweather thought about it. "Mostly. He's a fair man who has probably looked the other way once or twice when it was convenient, but he is not in Doyle's pocket the way some judges are. The notary error is the kind of thing that a man like Hartley cannot easily ignore in a public proceeding without ruining himself professionally. They worked until late that night, Fairweather and Ellen at the table with papers spread between them, and Ezekiel keeping the coffee hot, and occasionally looking over their shoulders, and asking questions that Fairweather said were good questions, the kind that came from someone who thought logically. Clement fell asleep in his chair by 9 o'clock, and Ezekiel covered him with a blanket from the chest by the wall without making a fuss about it. When they finally stopped, just after midnight, Fairweather went to the room Clement had arranged for him in the barn, which was not as uncomfortable as it sounds because Clement had put in a genuine cot and a lantern, and there was no argument about it. Ellen and Ezekiel stood on the porch in the dark, and the silence that followed a long, hard night of work. "Are you frightened?" he asked her. "I am tired," she said. "I have been frightened for so long that I believe I have used it all up." "That is either very brave or very exhausting," he said. "Both," she said. Then she turned to look at him, and the moonlight was full on her face, and she looked tired and determined and more beautiful to him in that moment than he had words for, which was a problem because he was not generally a man without words. "Ezekiel," she said, "why are you still here?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I want to be," he said. "Because when I think about somewhere that feels like a place I am meant to be, I keep thinking about here." He paused. "And about you." She did not look away. She said, "I have not had a great deal of luck with men who say things like that." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to trust me because I say things. I am asking you to let me show you whether I mean them." She was quiet. Then she said, "Come back tomorrow." "I will," he said. He came back tomorrow, and the day after, and on Friday morning the four of them drove in 2 wagons to Caldwell for the court hearing, Ellen and Fairweather in the lead wagon with the documents in a leather satchel, Ezekiel and Clement following. The courthouse was a 2-story building at the far end of Main Street, and there were more people outside it than anyone had expected, because word had spread the way it always does in small towns, with the speed and thoroughness of something that cannot be stopped. Clara Briggs was there, and half the people from the dry goods end of town, and several ranchers who did not like Doyle and had been looking for a moment to be publicly against him without being the first to do it alone. There were also 2 of Doyle's men on the far side of the street, watching. Doyle himself was inside with Alton Press, and a lawyer from Wichita who charged 3 times what Fairweather charged. Ellen walked through the door of that courthouse with her chin up and her hands steady, and Ezekiel walked behind her and a little to the left, close enough to be there and far enough not to crowd her, and Clement brought up the rear with the rolling, deliberate walk of a man who has been in more difficult situations than this, and is not going to be rushed. Judge Hartley was a large gray man with a drooping mustache, and the manner of someone who had heard too many arguments about too many things, and was disinclined to be impressed by anyone. He looked at the documents with his glasses pushed down on his nose, asked Fairweather 3 sharp questions and pressed 2 sharper ones, and then looked at the notary stamp for a full 30 seconds without speaking. "Mr. Press," he said, "this stamp is from Notary Higgins, William Higgins. I appointed William Higgins to that office myself in the spring of 1875. This document is dated 1871. Press opened his mouth. "Do not," the judge said quietly, "say anything that will make this worse for you than it already is." The silence in the room was very complete. "The lien is fraudulent," Judge Hartley said. "The court finds in favor of Miss Wilcox in full. The original deed stands. Any further action against this property based on this document will be treated as contempt." He looked up over his glasses at the back of the room, where Hector Doyle was sitting with the stillness of a man who is very angry and very controlled about it. "I would suggest, Mr. Doyle, that you confine your future acquisitions to property that is actually for sale." Doyle said nothing. He rose, and Press rose with him, and they left without looking at Ellen, which was either the last dignity of a proud man or the prelude to worse things. In Ezekiel's experience with men like Doyle, it was usually the prelude to worse things. But he kept that thought to himself for the moment because Ellen was shaking, finally, now that it was over, the held-together composure coming apart just slightly at the edges, and he was standing right next to her. "You won," he said quietly. "We won," she said, and then seemed to hear the word she had used and looked at him. And whatever she saw in his face made something in her expression shift. A softening that was not weakness, was something more like a door opening. Fairweather was talking to Clement in a satisfied, rapid way, and the people in the gallery were murmuring and starting to rise. And in the middle of all of it, Ellen and Ezekiel stood close together, and Ezekiel said, "Come on. Let me take you somewhere to eat that isn't your kitchen." She laughed, the first full laugh he had heard from her, and it was a good laugh, unguarded and real, and he felt something in his chest that he recognized because he had been trying not to name it for the better part of 3 weeks. They ate at the hotel dining room, the 4 of them, the best meal any of them had had in recent memory, and Fairweather told a long, involved story about a land dispute in Wichita that had ended with both parties locked in the same jail cell, which was so funny that even Clement laughed until he had to put his fork down. Ellen ate with the particular appetite of someone who has been too anxious to eat properly for days and is now making up for it, and she ate without any self-consciousness about it, which Ezekiel noticed and liked. After, when they were walking back to the wagons, Fairweather took his leave to catch the afternoon stage back to Wichita. He shook Ezekiel's hand and kissed Ellen's hand, and told her she was the most prepared client he had ever defended, and then told Ezekiel quietly, as he picked up his bag, that he should not let this one get away. Ezekiel told him he was working on it. The ride back to the farm was quiet in the good way, the way of people who are tired and relieved and satisfied, the wind coming from the southwest and the grass moving in its long tide and the sky doing its evening performance in pinks and golds. Clement fell asleep in the wagon approximately 6 minutes after leaving Caldwell, which was something of a record even for him. And Ellen drove and Ezekiel rode beside her, and they talked in an easy, unhurried way about nothing important. The crops, the weather turning, the quality of the food at the hotel, and all of it felt important anyway. When they reached the homestead, Ezekiel helped Clement to his bed, which the old man accepted without fully waking, and then he came out to find Ellen at the well, drawing water in the last of the light, not because she needed to, but because her hands needed something to do. He stood a little distance away and she said, "I keep thinking he will not leave it alone." "He might not," Ezekiel said honestly. "Men like Doyle don't like losing, but the court ruling is public record and so is the reason for it. Going after this property again would be very dangerous for him." "I want to believe that," she said. "I will stay close," he said, "if you want." She turned from the well and looked at him directly, the bucket in her hands and the last light in her hair. "That is a large thing to offer," she said. "I know what I am offering," he said. "Tell me," she said. He crossed to her then, closed the distance between them in 5 slow steps, and took the bucket from her hands and set it down, and then he stayed where he was, close enough that she had to look up to see his face, and he said, "I am offering to be here, to help keep what is yours, to get to know you better the way I told you I wanted to 3 weeks ago." He paused. "I'd like to court you, Ellen, if you'll let me, plainly and properly and without rushing it." She looked at him for a long moment. The stars were beginning to come out. "You are a plain-spoken man," she said. "I find it saves a great deal of time," he said. She put her hand on his arm, just her fingers on his forearm, and said, "Then yes, plainly and properly." He covered her hand with his briefly, just for a moment, and then stepped back to give her room, and she picked up the bucket and he held the door, and they went inside. The summer moved forward in the way that summers do when they contain something precious, both quickly and slowly at once. Ezekiel set up at the livery in Caldwell for the first 2 weeks, paying his way by doing work for the livery owner, who was glad to have an extra pair of capable hands. He came out to the farm every other day at first, And then every day, and the work he did was real work. He fixed the south fence line completely, the job that Clement had been describing as necessary since spring. He repaired the barn roof to a standard that Clement examined without comment and then nodded at once, which was high praise from Clement. He helped Ellen plant the late-season kitchen garden and learned the layout of the land, the way the water ran after rain, where the soil was richest, where it turned rocky near the east corner. He and Ellen fell into the rhythm of working people who are also falling in love, which is a rhythm that has its own particular music. They worked side by side more often than not and talked while they worked, which was more revealing than any formal conversation, because when your hands are busy, your guard is lower. He learned that she had read everything she could get her hands on, that she had opinions about most things and was not shy about expressing them, that she was strict about fairness and quick about kindness, and that she was lonelier than she let on because she had been carrying everything alone for 2 years and had developed the self-sufficiency of someone who cannot afford to wait for help. He told her things he had not told many people, about the drive north when a man and his crew had died in a creek crossing, a young man from Georgia named Samuel, and about the way Ezekiel had carried that for a long time, the question of whether he should have done something differently. She listened without flinching and without offering easy comfort, which was what he needed, and she said that she thought the weight of other people's endings was the price of caring about them, and that carrying it was right even when it was heavy. One afternoon in late July, 3 weeks after the court hearing, Hector Doyle's broad-shouldered man, whose name was Travis Cole, appeared on the road that ran past the eastern fence line. He was alone, and he sat his horse at the edge of the property and looked at the farm buildings for a long time. Clement saw him first and came and found Ezekiel in the barn, and Ezekiel walked out to the fence line and stood there and looked back at Travis Cole without speaking. Cole looked at him for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward Caldwell. That evening Ezekiel told Ellen about it without making it larger than it was, but also without making it smaller. "Doyle is watching," he said. "He's not done, but he is being careful, which means the court ruling scared him." "Should I be worried?" she asked. "Be alert," he said. "There's a difference." She thought about that. "What changed?" she asked. "When you saw me in that street 3 weeks ago, what made you ride in?" He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated because it was a serious question. "I have seen men push women around before," he said. "I have even stopped it before when it was in front of me. But what I saw with you was different. You were not just being pushed. You were fighting for something that was yours and right, and you were doing it alone, and you were about to be silenced in the middle of the truest thing you had said all day." He looked at her. "I could not sit on that horse and watch that happen." "Were you afraid?" she asked. "A little," he said, "but I find that afraid is not usually the most important thing I am in a given moment." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the first time she had reached for him, and they both knew it. He turned his hand over and held hers gently, and they sat like that for a while with the lamp burning between them and the night coming in at the windows, and Ellen thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like, that she had not known that before, but she knew it now. In August, Ezekiel moved out of the livery in Caldwell and took a room at the boarding house on the east side of town, closer to the farm and cheaper than the livery by a meaningful margin. He had also begun talking to a man named George Alderman, who had 120 acres adjoining Ellen's property on the north side, land that Alderman had been trying to sell for 2 years because his wife wanted to be closer to her family in Missouri. The price was reasonable. Ezekiel had the money, just about, if he was careful with it. He had not said anything to Ellen about this yet. He did not want to say it until he was sure, because he understood that the implication of buying land next to her farm was an implication about his future and hers, and he did not want to speak to that until he was ready to speak to all of it. He told Clement, though, one afternoon when they were working the fence together, because Clement was going to know anyway and because Ezekiel had developed a genuine respect for the old man's judgment. Clement listened and then said, You intend to ask her something?" "Yes," Ezekiel said. "Soon," Clement said. "Before winter," Ezekiel said. Clement drove another fence nail with one clean stroke. "Good," he said. On a Sunday in the first week of September, Ezekiel asked Ellen to ride out with him to the north property line. She came without asking why, in the way of someone who trusts the person asking, and they rode the line of Alderman's fence in the warm, early autumn morning, while the goldenrod was going yellow in the ditches, and the sky was that specific shade of high blue that Kansas only produces in September. He told her about Alderman's land. He told her about the money he had saved, about the 4 years of drives, about the deliberate saving that had been purposeful once he understood what he was saving for. He told her that 120 acres adjoining her 160 was enough for a real working farm, that the combined water rights and grazing land would be solid, that he had thought it through carefully and it made sense in every practical way he could calculate. And then he stopped his horse and she stopped hers alongside him and he said, "But I am not buying it for practical reasons. I am buying it because I want to be here. Because I want to be here with you. I love you, Ellen. I have known it since about the 6th day I knew you, and I have been waiting until I was sure I had something real to offer before I said it." She looked at him for a moment in the clear September light. Her horse shifted slightly beneath her and she stilled it without looking away from him. "You rode into a crowd for me before you knew my name," she said. "I know," he said. "That was earlier." She laughed, that good full laugh, and then she said, "I love you, Ezekiel. I have been trying to decide whether to say it first for about 3 weeks, which I believe you would find consistent with my general character." "Very consistent," he said, and the smile broke over his face completely, the way it didn't often, and it transformed him, and she thought that she would spend the rest of her life being glad when she caused that smile. He reached across and took her hand while their horses stood in the September grass and the wind moved everything gently around them, and he said, "Marry me. I would ask you properly on a porch or by a fire, but we are here and I cannot wait another hour." "You are asking me in a field," she said. "Yes," he said. "I accept," she said. "In a field." He looked at her, and then he got down from his horse and helped her down from hers and kissed her properly for the first time. There in the September grass with the goldenrod and the blue sky and both their horses standing patient beside them. And it was one of those moments that becomes a fixed point in a life, a before and an after. Clement, when told that evening, said, "Finally," and poured himself coffee with the air of a man whose long patience has been vindicated. And then he shook Ezekiel's hand with a grip considerably stronger than his age suggested he possessed, and hugged Ellen in the brief, fierce way of a man who has been the only family she had for 2 years. Ezekiel rode to Wichita the following week and sent a long letter to his parents in Missouri. His mother wrote back within 10 days, which given the post was nearly miraculous, and her letter was warm and full of questions, and contained, toward the end, a sentence that said she knew her son, and she knew from the way he wrote about Ellen Wilcox that this was right, the same way she had known about his father when she was 22 years old. Hector Doyle was not finished, as Ezekiel had suspected he would not be, but what he did next was more legal than physical, because the court ruling had genuinely frightened him. He attempted to file a new challenge on the water rights associated with Ellen's land, a claim that the underground aquifer feeding her well technically fell under a different land survey boundary. It was a thin claim, and everyone who looked at it said so, but it took Robert Fairweather 2 weeks of correspondence and another trip from Wichita in October to dispose of it properly. And during those 2 weeks, Ellen was fighting again, and Ezekiel was beside her in the way he had promised, not taking over, not moving in front of her, but present and steady and making sure she ate and slept, and did not let the anxiety consume all of her resources. When Fairweather disposed of the water rights claim through a letter to the court that was 17 pages of very specific legal reasoning, Doyle went quiet. Really quiet, not the managed quiet of a man regrouping, but the quiet of a man who has done the calculation, and found that the cost of continuing this particular campaign is higher than the value of the prize. Ellen's land, taken on its own, was not especially valuable to him. It was the principle of losing that had kept him pushing, and when losing became expensive enough, the principle stopped mattering. He left Ellen Wilcox's property alone for the rest of his life. Travis Cole, the broad-shouldered man who had come and looked at the farm and then ridden away, left Doyle's employ in November. He showed up at the farm one cold morning and told Ellen and Ezekiel that he was not proud of the work he had been doing for Doyle, and that he wanted them to know he had not laid a hand on anyone in service of taking their land, whatever else he had done. He was not asking for absolution. He was just stating the record. They thanked him for it. He nodded and left, and Ellen said afterward that she believed him, and Ezekiel said he did too. They were married in November at the Caldwell Methodist Church, with Clara Briggs and half the town present and Robert Fairweather having made the trip from Wichita again, because he said he would not miss it. Clement walked Ellen down the aisle because she asked him to, and he did it in his Sunday suit with his back perfectly straight and his chin up, and several people who knew him said they had never seen him stand so tall. The ceremony was simple, and the words were plain, and they said them clearly and meant every syllable. When the preacher concluded and Ezekiel kissed his wife in front of the Caldwell Methodist congregation, Clara Briggs cried openly and made no attempt to conceal it, and Clement looked at the ceiling with an expression of elaborate composure that fooled no one. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the practical way that first winters on the plains always are, cold coming down fast in December and the wind finding every gap in every building. But they were together in it, and that changed everything. Ezekiel had purchased Alderman's 120 acres in October, and in the winter evenings after the stock was fed and the barn was closed they sat by the fire and drew plans for the spring, where they would break new ground, where they would put a proper root cellar, where a second water trough should go. The planning was domestic and detailed, and entirely satisfying to both of them in the way that building a shared future together out loud is satisfying when you are with the right person. Clement's eyesight had continued its slow decline through the autumn, and by December he admitted, grudgingly and only to Ellen and only late at night, that he could no longer see well enough to do the fine repair work that had always been his specialty. Ezekiel, who had already understood this without being told, had quietly rearranged the farm tasks so that the work Clement did best, the feeding, the talking to animals, the checking of fences by touch and instinct, was the work Clement was given. Clement was too proud to accept obvious accommodation without protest, so Ezekiel arranged it so that it appeared to be the natural distribution of labor rather than an adjustment for his sake, and Clement accepted it without complaint, because the fiction was maintained skillfully enough to allow him his dignity. By February, Ellen told Ezekiel that she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen before breakfast, in the direct way she told him most things, and he put down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her, his face in her hair, saying nothing because there was no word adequate to the size of what he felt. Frightened, she asked against his shirt. Absolutely, he said, delighted, both completely. She laughed and held on to him. Me too, she said. The spring came the way Kansas springs come, in a rush, everything happening at once, the ground softening and the grass coming green, and the calving and the planting all competing for attention simultaneously. Ellen worked through April without slowing, because she was a healthy woman who had been doing hard physical work all her life, and she was not going to stop in April. But she allowed Ezekiel to take on the heavier lifting without making a protest of it, which was itself a measure of how much she trusted him. They broke the new North acres in May, Ezekiel with a proper 2-horse plow that he had bought with the proceeds from a short cattle run he had made in March, just far enough south to catch a trailing herd that needed extra hands for 2 weeks. The soil on Alderman's old land was good, not quite as black as Ellen's original acres but sound, and by the end of May they had 60 new acres under cultivation, wheat on 40, and the remaining 20 in kitchen, garden, and hay. Clement planted tomatoes with the focused devotion he brought to anything that required patience, feeling his way along the rows with practiced hands. And by June the garden was going strong, and Clement's tomatoes were, as they were every year, the best in the county, which was something he accepted with a modesty that was entirely unconvincing. Their son was born in the second week of September 1879, at the farmhouse, attended by the Caldwell doctor and by Clara Briggs, who had delivered enough babies to serve as a proper second pair of hands, and who appeared at the door that morning with a basket of provisions and the calm authority of someone who knows what needs to be done. The labor was long but not dangerous, and by the time the sun was going down the baby was in the world and Ellen was lying back against her pillow with the particular expression of someone who has just done the hardest thing they have ever done and come through it with flying colors. Ezekiel held his son in the way that large, capable men always hold newborns, with enormous care and slight terror, and looked at the small red face and the working fists and felt every wall he had ever built around himself come down completely. "He has your nose," Ellen said. "He has no nose," Ezekiel said. "He has a suggestion of a nose." "That is your nose in embryo," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her, his son in his arms. She was exhausted and her hair was undone, and she was looking at him with the warmest expression he had ever seen on any human face, and he said, "Thank you." "For what?" she said. "For every single thing," he said. They named the boy Thomas, for Ellen's father, with James as a middle name, for Ezekiel's grandfather. Thomas James Haskins, who looked up at the September Kansas sky from his first day in it with the unfocused but apparently interested gaze of someone taking in new information, entered the world at a good time, in a good place, held by capable and loving hands. Clara Briggs, when she had cleaned up and packed her basket and was getting ready to leave, leaned down and kissed Ellen's forehead and said, "Your mother would have been beside herself." Ellen held her hand for a moment. "I know," she said. "I feel her." Life on the Haskins farm, as it came to be known in Comanche County, settled into the rhythms of a working life that was also a happy one. The two farms had been consolidated now in every practical sense, the fences between them removed, the operations unified under Ezekiel's management and Ellen's, which was to say jointly, since they made every significant decision together at the kitchen table after supper. The farm grew, carefully and steadily. By 1880, they had added a small dairy operation, 4 cows whose milk Ellen sold to the hotel, and the boarding house in Caldwell for a price that she negotiated herself, arriving at the hotel manager's office with Thomas on her hip and a written list of prices and dairy yields that left no room for lowballing. The hotel manager, who had tried to lowball her, revised his offer after 3 minutes of conversation, and Ellen shook his hand and said she looked forward to a good business relationship. Ezekiel ran a small cattle operation on the North Acres, nothing on the scale of the trail drives, 20 or 30 head that he managed with Clement's help and the occasional assistance of hired hands during branding and drives to the Caldwell auction yard. He was not a man who needed to grow large. He needed to grow sound, and sound was what they built. Clement's eyesight was nearly gone by the spring of 1880, and the conversation they had about it, the 3 of them at the table one evening, was frank and kind. Ellen told him that his room in the house was his as long as he wanted it, which was something she had decided years ago. Clement said he was not going anywhere and he still had 2 good hands and 1 good ear, and that if anyone tried to move him off the farm they would discover that partially blind did not mean unable to make himself inconvenient. This was greeted with the laughter it deserved, and the matter was settled. In the summer of 1881, Ezekiel rode into Caldwell and came home with 2 books that a merchant had acquired as part of an estate sale, both of them in good condition, a collection of Shakespeare's plays, and a natural history of North America. He had thought of Ellen's father, who had read to her by lamplight, and he gave them to her at supper without ceremony, and she opened them and read the first page of the natural history and then looked up at him. "Where did you find these?" she said. "Briggs got them in from Wichita," he said. "Thought you'd like them." She looked at the books and then at him and said, "Have I told you that you are a good man?" "Once or twice," he said. "It remains true," she said. That winter, their second child, another boy they named Daniel Henry Haskins, arrived in January at full term and healthy, with a quantity of dark hair that the doctor said he had never seen on a newborn, and which Ezekiel told Ellen had clearly come from her side of things, and which Ellen pointed out was currently arranged on an infant who looked exactly like his father. Daniel was a loud baby and a happy one, with an appetite that impressed everyone who witnessed it, and a laugh that could be heard from the barn. Thomas, who was 2.5 and had been king of the household since his birth, made his adjustment to younger brotherhood with the full range of emotions available to a child of that age, including a 3-day period of deliberate gravity that Ezekiel told Ellen was the most dignified form of protest he had ever witnessed from anyone of any age. After the 3 days, Thomas decided that Daniel was interesting, particularly when Daniel grabbed Thomas's finger and held it, and from that point on Thomas was a devoted older brother. The letter from Ezekiel's parents arrived that February, saying they were thinking about coming west in the spring if the invitation was open. Ezekiel read the letter twice and showed it to Ellen, and she said, "Write back tonight. Tell them yes." His parents arrived in April of 1882, John and Ruth Haskins, in good health for their 60s, stepping off the stage in Caldwell with the alert expressions of people who have been traveling a long time and are not sure exactly what they have arrived into. Ruth Haskins took one look at the farm, at Ezekiel standing tall in the spring morning, at Ellen holding Daniel on her hip and Thomas pulling at her skirt, and she made a sound that was not quite words but contained everything, and she crossed the yard and embraced Ellen, who stood straight for a moment and then held on. John Haskins shook his son's hand and gripped his shoulder and looked at the farm and the fields and said, "Well done," and meant it. They stayed for 2 months, John helping with the spring work, Ruth keeping company with Ellen in the kitchen and the garden, and the kind of long conversations between women who are becoming family, conversations that ranged from recipes to remembered childhoods to the raising of small boys to the shape of the future. Clement took an immediate liking to John Haskins, because they were roughly the same age and both men of few words and precise opinions, and by the end of the first week, they had developed a companionship that manifested primarily in sitting on the porch together in the evenings and agreeing that the weather was going to do something eventually. When John and Ruth Haskins left in June to return to Missouri, Ruth held Ellen's hands at the stage and said, "I want you to know that from the first letter he wrote about you, I knew." "Knew what?" Ellen asked. "That this was the one," Ruth said. "Mothers always know." Ellen kissed her cheek. "Come back soon," she said. They would come back, twice more in the years that followed. It would be a regular thing, a point of warmth on both sides of the distance. The years moved forward with the particular grace of a life that is not without difficulty but is fundamentally whole. The cattle herd expanded carefully to 40 head, then 50. The wheat fields produced well in good years and adequately in the dry ones, because Ezekiel had listened to the older farmers in the county about dry years and had put in a water management system along the south field that held moisture better than the open rows had. Ellen's dairy operation became the most reliable income source during the drought years, because cattle needed water, but her 4 dairy cows she bobbied through everything. In 1883, Hector Doyle died. He died of a heart failure in his office in Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon, surrounded by his papers and his ledgers. The news traveled through the county in the way news travels, and there were people who mourned him and people who did not, and both responses were honest. His estate, which was substantial, went partly to a son in Denver who had no interest in Kansas and sold most of the land holdings over the following 2 years, which resulted in a general loosening of the county's agricultural situation that benefited many people who had been squeezed. Ellen, when she heard about Doyle's death, sat quietly for a moment and then said that she did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected relief or satisfaction or something with a sharper edge. What she felt was something closer to a final settling, like a weight that had been set down so gradually over 5 years that by the time it was fully gone you realized you had already moved on without noticing. "Do you regret it?" Ezekiel asked. "Any of it?" "The fight," she said. "Yes." "Not a day," she said. "Not a minute." He nodded. He had known that. He had just wanted to hear her say it. By 1884, their daughter arrived, a girl they named Ruth Ellen Haskins, who was born in June on a warm morning and who had from her first hour in the world the particular quality of watchfulness, looking around at everything with large dark eyes as if she was cataloging it all for future reference. Thomas was 4 and Daniel was 3, and the farmhouse, which Ezekiel had expanded with a new room and a larger kitchen in the fall of 1882, was full in the best way, full of noise and food and small running feet, and the accumulated presence of people who loved each other. Clement held Ruth Ellen on her first day and looked at her with his nearly sightless eyes and said, "Hello, girl," and the baby looked in his direction as if she could locate him precisely despite his quietness. And Ellen, watching this, felt something so full and good in her chest that she had to turn to the window for a moment. Ezekiel found her there, looking out at the fields in the June morning, their daughter's birth having just happened in the next room, and he came and stood beside her and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking about a dusty street in Caldwell in 1878, she said, "and a man on a roan horse." "Any specific memory?" he said. "You rode into that crowd," she said, before I could finish my sentence. "I did," he said. "I still apologize for that." "I know," she said, "but I am very glad you did it." He kissed her temple. Outside, the June morning was going on with full Kansas energy, the wind in the wheat, the dairy cows in their yard, Thomas and Daniel somewhere behind the barn engaged in something that was probably inadvisable, and the air smelled of grass and warm earth and all the work they had made together. "So am I," he said. The seasons layered themselves, each one adding to the substance of what they had built. The wheat harvest of 1885 was the best they had seen, a wet spring followed by a long, dry harvest window, and Ezekiel sold a portion of it at prices that allowed them to build a proper root cellar and replace the aging barn roof with good materials rather than making do. Ellen calculated that the dairy income and the wheat together had put them solidly past the point of anxiety, not wealthy, not even prosperous in the way that Doyle had been prosperous, but sound, their word, the word they used for the thing they had been building from the beginning. Thomas started at the Caldwell School in the fall of 1885, riding in with the boy from the nearest neighbor farm, a red-haired child named Peter who had been Thomas's best friend since they were both old enough to get into trouble together. Thomas came home the first day with the dazzled expression of a child who has discovered that there is a world outside his family's farm, and Ellen felt the particular bittersweet quality of that discovery, which she recognized from her own childhood memory. She had been starting a school correspondence course for Ruth, who was too young for the school ride but clearly hungry for letters and numbers, and she used the same books she had taught herself from, and some new ones she had ordered from a Wichita supplier through Clara Briggs. Clara, who was now the closest thing Ellen had to a sister, came out to the farm for Sunday dinners regularly and brought her husband, a quiet man named Warren who fixed wagons and had an enormous mustache, and who got along with Ezekiel in the easy way of men who respect each other's competence. Clement died in the winter of 1886, quietly, in his sleep, in the room that Ellen had given him years ago, and that he had occupied with the permanence of someone who knew his place in the world. He was buried on the farm because that was what he had wanted, expressed not as a formal request, but as a comment made once in passing that Ellen had retained with the accuracy of someone who loved a person and paid attention. The grave was in the small rise behind the barn where you could see the east fields in the morning, and there was a proper stone marker that Ezekiel ordered from the stonecutter in Caldwell, which read Clement Rudd, who kept faith with this land. Ellen cried without apology. She cried in the kitchen alone that first morning, and then she came out and worked, because Clement would have been the first to say that work was the correct response to grief, and she honored him with it. Ezekiel sat with her that evening and held her hand and said nothing much, because there was nothing much to say, and she leaned against his shoulder and he held her, and after a long time she said, "He knew us from the beginning." "He did," Ezekiel said. "He knew before we did," she said. "Probably," Ezekiel said. "He was a perceptive man." She almost laughed, and then she did laugh, and then cried again briefly, and Ezekiel held her through all of it without moving. In the spring of 1887, Robert Fairweather came from Wichita for the first time in 2 years, not on legal business but on personal business, which was that he had a case he needed to discuss with Ezekiel. Not a case involving their land, something else. A family in the next county, a widow and her 2 grown sons who were facing a situation not entirely unlike what Ellen had faced in 1878, a land seizure attempt through a fraudulent document. Fairweather had taken the case, but he needed someone who knew the county, who was respected, who could help gather witnesses and testify to the local context. He asked Ezekiel if he would help. Ezekiel asked Ellen first privately because it was her time as much as his, and she said, "You already know the answer. Go." He helped. He rode out with Fairweather over 3 days, talking to farmers and ranchers in the next county, gathering the kind of testimonial groundwork that Fairweather could build a legal case on. He testified at the hearing himself, and Fairweather won the case, and the widow kept her land, and Ezekiel came home sunburned and saddle-worn and satisfied in the specific way of a man who has used his skills for the right purpose. "How did it go?" Ellen asked when he rode in. "Well," he said. "Clara will want all the details," she said. "She already knows," he said. "I came through town." "Of course she does," Ellen said, and took his horse. By 1889 Kansas was changing, the territory settling, the wildest edges of the cattle economy giving way to farming operations and small towns with brick buildings and proper schools. The Kishom Trail drives were nearly finished, the railroads having changed the economics of moving cattle so thoroughly that the great long drives north were becoming memory rather than business. Ezekiel had driven his last trail in 1881, and the shift in Kansas from open range to farm country suited him because it suited Ellen, because the farm country was what they had built, and it was solid. Thomas, at 10, was working on the farm with the serious industry of a boy who has grown up knowing what work is and does not object to it. He had his mother's directness and his father's patience, a combination that Ezekiel told Ellen privately was going to make him either a lawyer or a very good farmer, and Ellen said she saw no reason it could not be both. Daniel was 8 and constitutionally incapable of moving at any speed less than a run, but capable of enormous concentration when he was interested in something, and what he was interested in was the dairy cattle, whom he knew by name and temperament, and who recognized him, and came to him in a way that animals do with people who genuinely see them. Ruth Ellen was 5 and already reading better than most of the children in the Caldwell school, a fact that her mother did not mention publicly, but that her father mentioned privately to Clara Briggs, who told everyone, which was fine because it was Clara, and that was what Clara did. On an evening in September 1889, 11 years from the Thursday morning when Ellen had walked into Caldwell with a deed in her fist and fury in her eyes, she and Ezekiel sat on the porch in the warm last light. The farm spread out before them, real and full in theirs, the wheat already harvested and the fields turned, the dairy cows standing in their evening calm, the children's voices coming from somewhere inside the house, Daniel's voice the loudest of the three as always. "Do you remember what I said to you?" Ezekiel asked. "That first evening on this porch." She looked at him. "You said you wanted to be somewhere you were meant to be," she said, "rather than somewhere you were passing through. And I said I wanted to know you better," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the farm, his farm, their farm, Thomas Wilcox's acres and George Alderman's old acres, and everything they had made of them together, and he felt the full, steady weight of a life that had become what it was supposed to be. "I was right about both," he said. She put her hand over his, the way she had once at a kitchen table when they were not yet to each other what they were now, and he turned his hand over and held hers the same way. "Ezekiel," she said, "do you know the thing I love most about you?" "Tell me," he said. "You never ask me to be less than I am," she said. "Not once. Not in the street, not in the courthouse, not in this house." He looked at her. The evening light was in her hair, which had more silver in it now than brown, a change that had happened gradually and which he found he loved, the way he loved everything about the way she had become herself more fully through the years of their life together. "Why would I?" he said. "You being fully yourself is the thing I love most. It is what made me ride into that crowd in the first place." She laughed, and the laugh was the same as it had always been, unguarded and real, the laugh he had first heard on the steps of the Caldwell courthouse. "You could have waited until I finished my sentence," she said. "I could have," he admitted, "but I didn't want anything to happen to you before I had a chance to meet you properly." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And they sat like that in the September Kansas evening with the wind moving the dry grass and the first stars beginning to come out over the plains, and the sounds of their children in the house behind them, and the farm before them, and 11 years of a love that had been built in the open, brick by brick, honest and earned and completely, permanently theirs. Inside, Daniel shouted something joyful and Thomas responded, and Ruth Ellen said something sharp and clever that made both her brothers go quiet, and Ellen felt Ezekiel's silent laughter through his shoulder, the contained, genuine amusement of a happy man, and she smiled and closed her eyes and listened to the wind and the voices and the farm. Everything that needed to be there was there. Everything they had fought for and built and loved was exactly where it should be. The land was theirs. The life was theirs. And in the long Kansas evening, as the stars came out one by one over the plains, that was entirely, completely enough.